Ever feel like your alcohol inks just aren't working the way you hoped? Maybe you're not sure where to start, or you've tried a few things and gave up. Don't worry, because I've got you. In this mashup video, I'm sharing my favorite easy techniques, Vellum tips, and how to save some money. And if you're ready to really explore alcohol inks, there's a 7-day free class that you do not want to miss. The link is in the description. Let's get into all of these videos. Do you feel intimidated when you think about using alcohol inks? Well, don't worry, because I have 3 techniques that are so simple and will help give you the confidence you need to start using them. And many of you have been asking about alcohol lift ink, so I'm going to show you a few ways that you can use it and give you some tips to get the best results. So let's get started. For this first technique, I'm going to be using some cotton balls. You're going to take a few of your favorite colors, add them directly to the cotton ball, and I like to give each color their own cotton ball. You can add a little bit of isopropyl alcohol to the cotton balls if you feel that you need a little bit more movement, but then you're going to start pouncing the cotton balls with the alcohol ink onto synthetic paper. I like to use either Yupo or craft plastic. If you want to make the colors more vibrant and add more depth to the background, you can go back in and add another layer of alcohol ink. Keep in mind that even though the bottom layer of alcohol ink is dry, it is going to react to the new alcohol ink that you are putting on top of it, and you will get a blend of colors. And just like that, you've made an alcohol ink background with no effort at all. And you won't want to miss how I take this background to the next level with alcohol lifting, so stick with me. For this next technique, we're going to be using those same cotton balls, but instead of randomly pouncing them on the background, we are going to be swiping them, alternating the colors. The colors I'm using today are Monsoon, Boysenberry, and Wild Plum. I really want to encourage you to use what you have on hand, but if you are wanting the colors that I'm using, I have them linked in the description box. Just like the previous background, I want the colors a little bit more vibrant, so I'm going to add another layer of alcohol ink right on top. You're not going to get a lot of depth in this background, but you can add more interest by overlapping the colors a little bit, and you're going to get a few new colors and a nice blend. And just like that, you have another background done. For this next technique, we are going to be adding the alcohol ink directly to a non-porous surface. I'm using a Glassboard Studio mat. If you don't have a glass mat, you can use some saran wrap and just place it on your work surface. Smooth it out the best you can and add your alcohol inks directly on top. And now we're going to add a little bit of isopropyl alcohol to help move the colors around. I'm going to take a piece of Yupo paper and smush it right into that alcohol ink. I slightly move my fingers on top so that the colors blend together, but not too much because I do want a little bit of white space. I didn't want that big blob in the center, so I'm trying to tilt it back and forth to see if I can get it moving around. I wanted the edge to blend out, so I added a little bit of isopropyl alcohol. Now I'm taking the Tim Holtz blower tool to move around the color. And now you have another background, but stick with me because I'm going to show you how to use the alcohol lift ink, and I'm going to take that last background and turn it into a card later on in this video. You're going to take a alcohol ink background that we created earlier, a stamp of your choice. This one is from the new stamp set from Tim Holtz from the Botanic Collage stamp set. You're going to ink up the stamp with alcohol lift ink, and I like to use my Misty along with my Stampendable tool so that I can make sure that I get a nice impression and lift all of that ink up. I will show you how to get that stamped image to stand out a little bit more, but first I'm going to take that ink that's on that stamp and stamp it onto another piece of Yupo paper. I'm using my Stampendable tool again to make sure that I get a nice crisp image. I love this technique because it's almost like a 2-for-1. You get the nice alcohol lift inked background and also a nice stamped image. All right, now we're going to take a paper towel and lift up that alcohol lift ink. And each time you lift up the ink, you need to make sure that you are moving to a clean piece of paper towel. This is going to help prevent adding the color that you're lifting up in areas that you don't want it. Now you can take the paper towel and swipe it over top of the image. This is going to get that last little bit of ink up, and you're left with a really cool background. But stamping isn't the only thing you can do with the alcohol lift ink. I'm going to put a piece of the Tim Holtz media grip down onto my glass mat. This is going to help keep that background in place. And for this technique, you're going to need the alcohol lift ink re-inker. And I'm going to actually tape my stencil down. This is going to keep the stencil in place. Then I'm going to take a finger dauber and tap it into the re-inker, and then I'm going to lightly tap it on top of the stencil, and this is going to add the alcohol lift ink in all of the areas that you can see. Once you get all the ink where you want, you're going to leave the stencil in place and grab a paper towel and dab it on top. You want to make sure that you're pressing firmly, but you're not moving that paper towel around on the background. And it's also important to keep switching to a clean paper towel. Once you get most of the alcohol lift ink up, you can take the stencil off and rub off all of the excess. And you're left with a really beautiful background. And you're able to get more use out of all of those stencils you might have. I don't know about you, but I love adding texture with things around my house. So I'm taking some bubble wrap, adding the alcohol lift ink, lifting up some of that ink, and I'm going to add it to one of the card panels that I created earlier. Using bubble wrap is such a unique way to add texture to any project. We are not done yet because I am going to take my favorite stamp from the whole release and create a card with it. I'm going to be taking the alcohol lift ink, inking up the stamp, stamping it onto that smushed background we created earlier, and it's going to lift up some of that ink. Now I'm going to stamp the image on a new piece of Yupo paper. All right, you know what time it is. It's splatter time. I cannot create a card or project without adding splatters. So I'm taking a paintbrush that I only use for alcohol inks and adding the splatters. I don't want to add too many splatters on top of the main floral image, so I covered it up a little bit. I wanted this card to have a little bit of dimension, so I'm popping up this card panel with some foam tape. I'm going to adhere it to another card panel that I embossed with a embossing folder. Now I'm going to add this sentiment that I embossed with some gold embossing powder, and my card is complete. I really hope this video has inspired you to break out your alcohol inks and start using them. Alcohol ink on vellum. The paper always curls, and it's a bit of a mystery on what adhesive to use. I am going to share different alcohol ink techniques and give you several tips that will help you gain the confidence you need to try it for yourself. I am also going to let you in on my secret to adhering vellum. This video is a collaboration with my friend Jerry. She will be sharing a technique I didn't even think you could do with alcohol inks, and I will link her video at the end of this one. Let's get into it. I found that the brand and thickness of the vellum is not what mattered most when using alcohol inks on it. It was actually how much ink I was putting on top of the vellum. I will work on a larger piece than I actually need, and I will add the alcohol ink only to the center, making sure I don't add too much. The first technique I will be showing you is alcohol pearls on vellum. The most important thing to remember when working with the pearls, no matter the surface, is you have to use blending solution. The pearls will not move around with just isopropyl alcohol. You also need to make sure you shake up the bottle to get the mica moving around. I added some blending solution to the center of my vellum, and I will add drops of the alcohol pearls on top of the blending solution. I'm going to use my Conair hair dryer on low to move around the ink. I slightly tilt the dryer and quickly move it around until the ink is dry. I like to add some splatters with isopropyl alcohol, and this helps add interest and texture to the background. I also love to add gold splatters. I use a Ranger Gold Mixative for this. It works perfect. And stick with me because I'm going to share how I turn this background into a simple card later on. Now let's try some alcohol lift ink. I really didn't know if this was going to work on the vellum, and I was hoping it would because I knew the results would be amazing. I started by creating my background and making sure to add the ink to the center of the vellum. If the ink gets too close to the edges, it will curl up. After the ink is dry, I will place a stencil on top, and then I take the alcohol lift ink refill and add some to the domed blending brush. I take the tool and pounce it through the stencil until I get the ink all over. Then take a paper towel and soak up some of that lift ink. It's important to take your time getting the lift ink off, making sure to use different parts of the paper towel and to pounce the paper towel on, not to rub it on top of the alcohol lift ink. Once most of the lift ink is up, you can then take the paper towel and rub off any remaining ink. I was so excited to see that this worked on vellum. I am now going to take a stamp and use a lift ink with it. You're just going to ink up the stamp like you would with any other ink. I'm not too particular about getting a perfect stamped image, so I'm not going to be using a stamp positioner. I press the stamp firmly onto the vellum, and then I'm going to use a paper towel to get the ink up. I love the subtle floral image on this background. Because I love adding texture and different layers, I'm going to take the same colors I used to create the background and add some splatters. The colors I used are from Ranger, and the first color is Moss and the second color is Monsoon, and you can find a full supply list in the description box below. I don't know about you, but all of this texture makes my heart happy. One simple way to add texture is using plastic wrap. I have done this technique with watercolors, but I wanted to see what it would look like with alcohol inks. I am still working on Vellum, so I add some blending solution and alcohol ink to the center of the paper. I use my Conair tool to move the ink around, but I do not want it to dry completely. So when I like the look of the ink, I will crumple up the plastic wrap and set it right on top. I set the paper aside to dry for about 30 minutes, and I was a bit impatient, so the ink was not fully dry, but I still love the texture that I got. I dried the ink in place, and I'm going to add some splatters like I did on the other backgrounds. But this time I am going to add some more texture by taking the same plastic wrap, crumpling it up even more, and I spritz the plastic wrap with some isopropyl alcohol and smush the plastic wrap onto the paper. This technique is so easy to do, and it adds so much interest to the background. I couldn't help but add some gold splatters to this background as well. Now that I shared 3 different alcohol ink techniques on Vellum, it's time to share my secret to adhering Vellum to a card base. Liquid adhesive doesn't work well with Vellum, so I like to use double-sided adhesive sheets from scrapbook.com. I cut the adhesive sheet slightly smaller than my background panel, which measures 4 by 5 1/4. I take the backing off from one side of the adhesive sheet, line it up the best I can on my background, and then I am going to peel off the other side of the backing. I am going to line up the vellum the best I can on my card base. I want to keep the background as visible as possible, so I cut out a leaf from my Cricut machine, and I didn't want to do any stamping, so I added a sticker for a quick sentiment. Alcohol inks are so versatile. Are you ready to take your alcohol inks from this to this? Then stick with me, because I am going to walk you through this technique step by step so that you gain the confidence you need to try it for yourself. So go grab your supplies and let's create. I have a piece of craft plastic paper and different things to make circles with, and I'm going to place my first container on the paper and apply the alcohol ink around the circle. I am going to quickly dry the ink in place with my low heat hair dryer, keeping the container right where it is. This is going to create a really concentrated area of color, and that's what you want. I have a fine tip bottle with some isopropyl alcohol in it, and I'm going to place a drop on the outer edge of the ink. With my Tim Holtz blower tool, I gently squeeze it to blow a small amount of air at a time, and I blow the isopropyl alcohol into the dried ink and then blow the ink outwards. I continue to do this until all of the ink is dry. I am going to take another small amount of ISO and add it to the outer edge of the dried ink, and then repeat the process of blowing small amounts of air to move the ink back and forth until the ink is dry. It's important to try not to get any of the ink inside of the circle if you want all of that white space. The blower tool is great for this because you have so much control of how much air comes out. And when the ink is dry, you can move on to the next section. This time I added a small amount of ISO in the direction I want the ink to go. This helps move the ink easier around the page. If you want more of a wispy look on the ends, then you need to move a lot of that ink back to the circle. I am going to start on my second circle by choosing a different color ink and a different sized cap, and I'm going to overlap the second circle over the first one. This is going to add a lot of interest and in some areas create a whole new color. It's important to dry the ink in place so when you add the ISO you have more control of how much color you move around. How much air you puff out of the blower tool is the most important thing to master for this technique. So remember to lightly press the tool as I am showing you here. I am barely squeezing it, letting out the littlest amount of air. You can also flick your wrist while squeezing out some air to get more movement of the color. As I move the color back and forth, you could see that I'm trying to blend it out and create a wispy effect by pushing the color back into the circle. And if you're not getting the wispy effect that you want, like I didn't here, I am going to actually add a little bit more isopropyl alcohol, and that's going to mute the color. As I move the ink back and forth, I wanted to talk a little bit about ink transfer. That gold you see was dried onto my container, so when I added the alcohol ink around it, it transferred onto the paper. So keep this in mind when you're creating yours, and clean off your caps if you don't want your previous color to transfer to your next circle. I am going to finish up my second circle and start on my third one. And at this point, I'm starting to think about composition, and I use that term very loosely because I barely passed art class in high school. So even though I may know simple things like rules of three, I really don't like to think of all the technicalities because then I feel stuck, and that is not a good place to be. So instead, I go with what feels right, and I add the third circle knowing I want a fourth circle in the upper right-hand corner. I also want this circle to be more of the focal point and stand out, so I add a little bit more of the alcohol ink around the circle. This is going to make the color very concentrated, and you're going to get a lot of contrast when you're starting to blend out the color. I added the third circle over top of the second circle to add more interest. At first, I thought I would go in with Q-tips to clean the ink out of the center of the circle, but as I was working on it, I liked that I had a couple with more white space and one that was filled in with the opposite color. As I'm moving the color back and forth, the blue is starting to mix in with the purple, creating a whole new color and adding so much interest to the piece. If I see the section I'm working on is turning out how I want, I will blow the excess isopropyl alcohol off of the paper, and I like to have a piece of heavy cardstock underneath what I'm working on to catch the excess ink. I liked how the purple looked in the center of the blue circle, so I wanted to create the same effect, blending some of the blue into the purple circle, but I also didn't want the circle full of color, so I kept some white space. I am going to add the fourth circle in the upper right hand corner, and I didn't blend any of the color out because I felt there was enough on the page already. I add some metallic with rose alloy ink the same way I added the color, just putting a little bit around the edge of the container, and I'm going to dry it in place. I'm taking some of the rose alloy alcohol ink and adding some splatters with a paintbrush. And because I'm a firm believer there can never be too many splatters, I'm going to take some Monsoon and Boysenberry and add some splatters around the page. Without even realizing it, I ended up adding 3 circles with the rose alloy alcohol ink, creating an odd number of circles after all. I'm going to dry the circles in place with my Conair hairdryer. As I finish up this piece, I'm realizing that I don't have any idea what I want to do with it just yet, and that's okay. What if I told you that I found a cheaper alternative to Yupo paper for alcohol inks? I know, I was pretty skeptical too. But not only is this paper cheaper, it did something that I was not expecting. And I was so shocked I had to show you. But first, let's compare the two side by side. I have always used Yupo paper for my main substrate when using alcohol inks. It didn't matter the brand, I found them all to be very expensive, and that kept me from using my inks as much as I would like to. I was able to pick up the paper on Amazon for about $16 for a pack of 25 12 by 12 sheets. That makes this about half of the cost of Yupo paper. Yep, you heard me right, half of the cost. The paper is from Graphics and it's called Craft Plastic. I knew I would be getting the most bang for my buck as far as price goes, but would the quality be there? Before I told you about it, I needed to put it through the test. And it does something Yupo paper does not do. And I will tell you why I think that it is important, so stay with me. I have the Graphics paper on the left and the Yupo paper on the right. I am taking some Ranger Wild Plum alcohol ink and adding it directly to both papers. I wanted to make sure the Craft Plastic wasn't going to do anything weird when I added the isopropyl alcohol, so I added a few drops and the ink moved around well on both papers. Now I am going to add the isopropyl alcohol first and then add a few drops of Boysenberry Ranger alcohol ink to see if the paper and ink would react differently. Nothing crazy happened, and at this point I'm already thinking this paper is worth it. There are still a few things I wanted to test out before making my final decision. Up to this point, I was using a blow dryer on a low cool setting, but I needed to see how the paper would react to heat. So I took out my embossing tool to put it to the test. Both papers are plastic, so it's recommended not to use high heat, but if all you have is an embossing tool, I needed to make sure that the graphics paper could hold up to a little bit of heat. The Yupo paper warped and crinkled almost instantly when I held the heat tool close. It did take a couple more seconds for the other paper to warp and crinkle, so the Craft Plastic holds up just a little bit better to the heat than Yupo paper does. But that's not what sold me on the paper. It's what happens next. When I'm using alcohol inks, I don't always like what I'm creating. So to save money, sometimes I take some rubbing alcohol and some baby wipes and wipe off all of the alcohol ink so I can start over on the same piece of Yupo paper. As you can see, the Yupo paper stains, so I'm stuck using similar colors or darker colors. Now it's time to test out the graphics paper to see if the ink would wipe off. And it did, but I thought there's no way it just wiped completely clean. So I added a little bit more rubbing alcohol and I thought, yep, it stains just like Yupo. Until I changed to a clean baby wipe and added more rubbing alcohol. And I could not believe that it was basically brand new again, minus a small section I used with the heat tool. That part stained, but that's okay because I don't plan on using a heat tool to move my alcohol inks around. Being able to start over is important sometimes because it will help give you that little bit of confidence that you need just to start, knowing that everything you used wouldn't be wasted. I don't know about you, but this gets me so excited to use alcohol inks even more now. I hope you enjoyed this mashup of some of my favorite alcohol ink tips and techniques. If you're feeling inspired, don't forget to check out my free 7-day alcohol ink class. It's a perfect way to build some confidence. And if you're ready for even more inky magic, be sure to check out this playlist right here. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, don't forget to stay creative, my friends.